Hi, this is Mark News from Plant Talk Radio. Thanks for subscribing and listening to our podcast, Your Gardening Questions from Plant Talk Radio. To keep this podcast free, we're partnering with Stoke Seeds. Indoor seed starting is fun, easy, and economical. Now's the time to start your seeds. If you're looking to grow vegetable variety or add a punch of color to your flower garden, review the Stoke Seeds Starting Guide online. You'll find information about soil preparation, moisture, temperature, light, transplanting, and more. The Stoke Seeds website is a complete resource center you need to make your garden the envy of the neighborhood. Get growing with Stokes. Now, today's question. Now, we received, an email this week from one of our podcast listeners. He lives in the Philadelphia, Pennsylvania area, and he says he's trying to figure out what to plant on his patio for a privacy screen. And he asked several questions, so we'll go through this. His name's Al, and he says the location of the planters would be on the southeast, facing a paver patio that gets sun from sunrise to 4 p.m. in the summer. I have kids, so I want to avoid anything that's toxic, like he says English laurel. I was originally planning on putting hornbeams or beech trees in and forming a hedge, but I've since been advised not to do that because they may not do well in planters that are roughly 5 to 6 feet in length. So the question is, first of all, how deep of a planter would I need to put in some large plants?
Well, if you're using something like beech trees or hornbeam, I think you're going to need a planter that's at least 4 feet wide and maybe 4 feet deep. The issue becomes the amount of area that the root system has to grow in, and also the planters are above ground, so you're contending with what temperature you have in the wintertime. When it gets down around zero and it stays there for a while, those planters tend to freeze dry and the plant dehydrates and dies. So you want to use a generous sized planter if you're putting plants in it, and also keep in mind that at some point in time in the life of those plants in the planters, you may have to replace them. Mm-hmm. But aesthetically, in certain areas, the planters really look nice, along with some nice plants in there. There are some other plants that might be good for screening besides the two that you mentioned. You might consider something like an arborvitae, like a narrow-growing arborvitae, like emerald green is a good variety. Mm-hmm. Another one might be a shrub called fine-line buckthorns. It was a proven winner selection a few years ago, and it tends to grow real dense and vertical, but not too tall, and it can be trimmed and creates a nice screen. Mm-hmm. So those are a couple that you might consider. The other thing to think about on a screen is, do you want a green in the wintertime, or is that a priority? Because there are a number of shrubs that, you can keep trimmed, but of course they're going to lose their leaves in the wintertime. And then do you want something flowering? You might consider something even like dwarf lilacs or something like that you can trim, but that are going to give you some nice color in the summertime. But again, in any kind of a cold climate, it's a risk. I mean, as you mentioned, you may get 3 or 4 years in a row where you don't get those frigid below zero temperatures, but then one year you get them, and then you're going to end up replacing plants. And then also you might get into a situation that we talked about earlier that only 1 or 2 of the plants will die, and then you're going to have a sort of a mismatched looking planter. Right. Another thing you might consider is to put a trellis in that planter. and then plant something like we talked about earlier, like sweet autumn clematis or an earlier season blooming clematis. There's a lot of vines that are grown for that purpose of screening and give you some flower too. So that might be something else to look at. And perennials are a little more tolerant of the cold temperatures in a large planter because there's a larger area for them to grow the root system in. So that might be something to take a look at also.
Well, I know later on in his email, Al also mentioned a couple of other plants. I wanted to get your opinion about either bamboo or horsetail reed.
Well, bamboo I'm familiar with in a container should do well. If you plant bamboo in the ground, then you have to you definitely want to put in some kind of a barrier down about 18 inches in the ground so the bamboo does not spread from where you originally planted. It tends to be very aggressive, and so if you plant it in the ground, you want to be sure and contain it. In a container, a raised above ground container makes a nice screen. You may need to cut it back each year, depending on how tall you want it to grow and what variety you're using. But in a container, it should be fine.
Are you familiar with the horsetail reed?
I'm not, but that would also be a plant you'd want to do a little research on to see what the root zone requirements are for it.
And he'd also mentioned maybe boxwoods.
Boxwoods are going to be like most any other plant that you put in a container. You just want to have something that is of a generous size so there's plenty of room for the roots to grow. And then you want to use an upright variety, especially if you want some screening.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things Al mentioned is that he may be able to move the planters indoors in the winter, maybe into a garage or something, but we're talking about some very large planters here, so that seems to be that would not be very practical.
No. Yeah, you'd have to have some kind of an equipment to be able to pick up the weight of that planter or fabricate some kind of device that you can roll it in and out with. But inside in the wintertime, a evergreen plant does not respond real well to it. And of course, the other thing that you have to remember when you put a planter inside is that it's going to dry out. So you have to remember that, a couple times in the winter, you want to go out and water it.
Yeah.
So
now, just in general, if people have maybe smaller planters and they'd like to put some things out, those might be a little more practical to get a dolly under or something and take them in. But at the same time, how do the plants respond to being indoors in the winter?
Well, a lot of them just go dormant. So as long as they get a little bit of moisture, they should do fine. I know people who, for instance, raise cannas, and that's a bulb that, can't freeze in the wintertime. And they'll cut the cannas back and leave them in their containers and take them and store them where they won't freeze, but they stay cool. And each year, they respond real well. Those kind of things, again, if they get a little bit of water in the wintertime, you don't have to go out every week and drown them, but just a little bit of water in the soil will help it from dehydrating.
Thanks again for listening to the podcast. Remember, lose the winter blues and garden indoors. Start your indoor seeding with the help of Stokes Gardening Guide, plus their online articles. For the best selection of vegetable, flower, and herb seeds available, go to stokeseeds.com. Catalogs are still available. Cultivating successful growers for generations.